Welcome to the podcast of the Consortium for History of Science, Technology, and Medicine. I'm Babak Ashrafi. Today is September 14, 2020, and we'll be speaking with three guests: the President of the American Association for the History of Medicine, the President of the History of Science Society, and the President of the Society for the History of Technology. This podcast episode is a recording of the weekly meeting of the Consortium's current and past fellows. Normally, this seminar is an informal discussion of the project of one of our current fellows, who might be a graduate student starting a dissertation or a tenured faculty member finishing up a book. We normally talk about research questions and methods, working in the collections of consortium member institutions, and maybe some preliminary findings. In addition to fellows, we have other guests who might talk about one of the collections or issues of recent interest to the profession. The meeting you're about to hear is more structured for the purpose of creating a podcast recording. Only the society presidents appear in the video. About 30 fellows are participating off-screen, sending their questions and comments via text chat. Our three discussants are Jan Golinski, who is president of the History of Science Society and professor of history and humanities at the University of New Hampshire; Thomas J. Misa is president of the Society for the History of Technology. He directed the Charles Babbage Institute at the University of Minnesota from 2006 to 2017, where he taught in the History of Science, Technology, and Medicine program. Keith Wailoo is the president of the American Association for the History of Medicine. He is Henry Putnam University Professor of History and Public Affairs at Princeton University, where he teaches in the Department of History and in the School of Public and International Affairs. He is former chair of history and former vice dean in the School of Public and International Affairs. So we all know about the annual meetings and the journals, but I wonder if there are new initiatives and projects. I know there are many, many committees on each of the societies. If there's new initiatives, projects, or directions that your societies are pursuing and that we might look forward to or take the opportunity to participate in. Keith, would you start with the American Association for the History of Medicine?
Sure. And Babak, I just want to thank you for pulling this really terrific conversation together. In some ways, the pandemic has altered the landscape for initiatives for our association. And the challenges that it poses are sort of obvious: the cancellation of in-person meetings. We canceled our May 2020 meeting, loss of opportunities for scholars to exchange work and to gather socially. The economic collapse has created impediments for certainly job prospects, not to mention research in archives and the closure of libraries, and all of which have had adverse implications for senior scholars and junior scholars. So what are the initiatives? Well, one of the important things that we've done is to move our canceled May meetings, many of those panels, online for this late fall, November, December, and January. We worked with about 12 host universities to try to maintain and sustain the kind of vibrant scholarly interaction, and in some ways, maybe even opening up what had been closed meetings to broader, larger audiences. So I guess if I'd say there was one theme of the year, and I actually became president in May, it's the idea of taking what is a challenge and pursuing opportunities, turning it into an opportunity. So for instance, we looked across the pond at what the British Society for the History of Science did with its global digital history of science festival. And because our 2021 meeting is canceled as well, we've been thinking about how to actually do a vibrant, interesting AAHM 2021 conference. And so what that's involved is creating a remote arrangements committee for moving online, but maybe moving online that's more than just a series of Zoom talks, or more than just doing remotely what we would normally do in person. So we've constituted a committee. So that's probably, these two are major initiatives going into this year, both kind of making use of this online venue, pivoting to the online world, and realizing that it's here to stay in some ways. And so making the best use of it. I should say one last thing, which is that in the wake, well, in the lead up to the cancellation of our May 2020 meeting, one of the things I did before I became president is organize a 2-day pandemics webinar. And I was stunned by the engagement and turnout. It was open to the public, and we had something like 3,800 attendees from 49 countries over the course of 2 days. In some ways, the AAHM is well suited to this moment because the issues brought to the fore by the pandemic are issues that our members have been studying and writing about for their entire careers. And so the last thing I'll end on is that when the American Historical Association asked us to partner with them to ask our members how they have been engaging with the pandemic in terms of public education, we polled our members and asked them to submit their op-eds, their blogs, their podcasts, et cetera. And we had about 200 members, everywhere from graduate students to junior scholars and postdocs to senior members, who have been writing and active in this space. So in some ways, I'd say we've been pivoting into this space that's created by the pandemic, but really our members have been doing it, and we've been following them and encouraging them along the way.
Thank you, Keith. Jan, about the History of Science Society?
Yeah, okay. Well, let me start by echoing Keith's thanks, Babak, to you and your colleagues for organizing this symposium. So yes, I guess like Keith, we're looking for opportunities in crisis, and we've tried to take advantage of those. We have a slightly different annual schedule than the AAHM, so our fall meeting has been cancelled or postponed, and instead we are working jointly with SHOT on an online meeting designed from the ground up as an online meeting. As Keith mentioned, we were inspired and encouraged by the example of the British Society, which with their festival over the summer, and so we now have in an advanced stage of planning, what we're calling a virtual forum, which will occur in October 8th to the 10th with SHOT. And the program is now up online. You can find it on our website, and registration is open. And we took a few sessions from the meeting that we were planning to have in person in New Orleans. We reconfigured those slightly because, of course, you can't simply carry an in-person conference session over to an online platform. So we reconfigured the sessions. We chose sessions that in some ways addressed the present moment, provided historical context to some of what's going on at the moment. We also put together from scratch a series of sessions on what we're calling futures, trying to look ahead with the advantage of the historical insights that our members have. One of them is going to be on the future of scholarship in the history of science, one on the future of the profession, and one on the future of the society. And so those are all things that we're all thinking about intensely, and it's going to be really interesting and useful to hear what some of our members have to say about those issues. There's also going to be a conversation with our Sarton medalist, Jim Bennett, who's a leading practitioner of the history of science in relation to its material culture and instrumentation. Jim represents the branch of our profession that has pursued its careers in the museum world. And another thing that we have launched recently is a new caucus in the society, which is called CALM. It's the caucus for people who work in archives, libraries, and museums. This is one of the ways in which we are reflecting a situation in which people are likely increasingly to be making their careers in the history of science, technology, and medicine outside the traditional academic structure. We also have a committee called HSS at Work that also tries to serve the needs of those colleagues who are in other kinds of professional locations. We have other caucuses that are somewhat longer established. One for graduate and early career caucus, which represents graduate students and people in the first few years of their professional careers. And we recently chose a non-voting member of the council from that, or largely representing that group, an early career representative on council. There are those ways, in addition to the virtual forum, other ways in which within the structures of the society we're trying to recognize the changing dimensions of the profession in history of science and figuring out how to serve a membership that is likely to become more diverse. We're very interested in diversification and other dimensions also in our membership and its internationalization, which is a goal that we've been setting ourselves for a few years now, coming out of a strategic planning activity which we undertook a few years ago. So my voice is failing me, but that's what I wanted to bring forward.
Thanks, Jan. Let me encourage the fellows and guests to put their questions or comments or follow-ups in the chat to Larry Kessler to share with the discussants. Tom, what new directions are we looking at from SHOT's point of view?
Sure. My thanks to you, Bob Buck, and the consortium as well. I was thinking of this, and maybe you can draw like a Venn diagram with 4 circles. And so these are initiatives that both predated the COVID crisis and pandemic and the situation we're in, but they interact with it in a kind of powerful way. So the 4 circles, I see them as with a small society, the key thing is to get the overlap to be as large as possible, because otherwise you go in 4 separate directions, and that's a real challenge. So the first one is internationalization. SHOT's been talking about internationalization for both 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, long time. And in December, we passed a formal internationalization plan, and that is basically set up to more formally engage both where SHOT's been outside North America, which is Europe, to develop Asia, and then also to be reaching out more firmly to Latin America and Africa. The second one is, it was prompted really by the mountain of food that we threw away in Milan. And every society throws away a mountain of food. And a young member came up to me and said, well, you have to do something about this ecological disaster that's the SHOT meeting. So we started talking about the ecological impacts, and it's not only the food that we throw out, but it's the travel and the tremendous amount of people on an airplane. So we started an initiative and trying to think carefully about what we really want out of an annual meeting. So we have an initiative there. And that really is focusing on the kinds of activities that we want. And of course, with an online meeting, you get the deck of cards thrown up in an incredibly different way. That's number 2. Number 3 is really a response to the racial reckoning. We had some younger members that said this is an imperative SHOT must address this moment. And there's several different things going on from the center, so to say. Arvind Mohan and I have started a President's Initiative on racial justice, and we're going to be, with luck, on Friday passing that through our policymaking body, the SHOT Executive Council. But that'll be a way that we try to adjust, bump, change, improve our engagement with scholarship and viewpoints that we want to be connected with. And so that will be something that we'll be announcing publicly. We were in a kind of quiet phase of fundraising and setting things up for this summer. And then the fourth one is really looking at, well, it's governance and strengthening governance and trying to connect the different pieces of SHOT, the different committees, different members, different functions and activities more closely, not only with the SHOT officers, but also with the SHOT Executive Council. And the Executive Council had been a body that had been meeting twice annually, and we switched about a year and a half ago to monthly Zoom meetings. So we were just slightly ahead of the curve there. So we've got an early version of Zoom fatigue or something, I think, sometimes. But you can see the character of the society as a whole is one of the things that's at the center. So how do we organize international contacts? How do we organize meetings that don't put everybody on an airplane? How do we mobilize information technology, virtual forums, software tools that we are not expert with at all? So we have to be on a learning curve there. How can we connect the annual meeting better to the perspectives as well as the people that have historically been underrepresented, and how can we strengthen our own governance processes? So those are the sort of four circles of the Venn diagram, and I try to find as many places right square in the center as I can. And the character of the annual meeting is something that's been much on our mind, and you can see that that radiates outward to each of those four. So those are some of the things. They preceded the COVID crisis. And some of them are standing independent of the COVID crisis, but they're challenged by that. And I think all of us are trying to figure out ways of connecting better with our members. I found a meeting. This was away in the spring. It was an IEEE meeting. You know, the kind of the electrical engineering profession. They have a whole big meeting on virtual reality. Those people loved having their physical meeting canceled because they had all these great tools and techniques and software platforms. They ran 3 separate software platforms. Jan and I have scratched our heads a little bit on this. We can run one. We have to choose that very carefully. But these IEEE people were just thrilled, essentially, to have all these tools and techniques. And so those are some things that we probably are going to be learning about. Zoom does some things well and some things not so well. So we may be scratching our heads and trying to come up with some good approaches to that.
Thank you, Tom. We've had some questions that actually anticipate our next discussion question. So I'll ask that, and then I might follow up with some of these. So many of our fellows, not all, but many of our fellows are advanced graduate students or recent postdocs. So how do these junior scholars, advanced graduate students, and young postdocs fit into the activities and structures of your societies? And so I'm going to add to that one of the questions we got, and independent scholars, people who don't have an affiliation with an academic institution. What kinds of roles might these kinds of scholars have in these societies? Jan, do you want to start us off talking about the History of Science Society?
Sure. So, I mean, the traditional thing was that they come to meetings, but that's certainly not the only way in which they can be involved in the society, and not the only way in which the society can serve them. So I've mentioned our Graduate and Early Career Caucus, which is an extremely active grouping within the society that organizes its own events and has a high profile in social media. And I mentioned also our caucus for people who work in archives, libraries, and museums. So our aim is really that we should serve the professional needs of everybody in the history of science, who's active in the history of science, regardless of whether they're following a traditional academic career track or another one. And we have, as I mentioned, reformed our governance structure to the extent of electing a representative, an early career representative to council. We're in the process of figuring out how to make that a permanent feature of our governance operations. We're also engaging in actually an even broader reconsideration of governance structures. The vice president of the society, Karen Rader, has initiated a process that we're calling the ITGR, Inclusive and Transparent Governance Review. And she's been soliciting opinions very widely within the society and outside about ways in which we can make our governance structures more transparent and more inclusive. And we're waiting to see what recommendations will emerge from that process. But there is at least one session at the forthcoming virtual forum, as I mentioned, on the future of the society. And we'll be looking to the participants in that session and to others who might attend that session for input into that process of improving the inclusiveness and transparency of our governance organizations. So there really is an opportunity at this particular moment in the society's history for junior scholars and independent scholars and others who have felt marginalized in the past to really have an input into changing the structures of the society to make them more inclusive.
Thanks, Jan. Tom, you know, tell us about young people, young scholars, independent scholars at SHOT.
Yeah, ESIG, History of Science has caucuses. We have interest groups. So many of our topical interest groups or thematic interest groups are not caucuses, but interest groups. So ESIG, Early Career Interest Group, is the group of active graduate students, postdocs, and early career people. SHOT ended up about 4 or 5 years ago deciding that their perspective was so important. We would hear rumors about what the graduate students were talking about. So we ended up actually changing our composition of our executive council, and we have a voting member of the graduate students from ESIG. And the graduate students, the ESIG group, votes on their representative, but that's a full voting member. So just like any other voting member, it's an elected position for a 2-year term. And I think that's just been really helpful because it not only gives, you know, the early career people a voice at the table for these monthly meetings. So it's a substantial commitment of their time and effort, but it's also just really valuable to hear both formally and informally about what people outside the more senior realms of, you know, typically SHOT officers are senior. That's just the nature of the game. So that was a helpful change. ESIG has been involved with doing scholarly workshops. They basically run a one-day workshop prior to our annual meeting. And they're also talking about the need for additional professionalization workshops that they would run through the compass of this year. I think independent scholars have been mainstreamed within SHOT for quite a long time. We've had both junior, senior, and very distinguished members that have not had a traditional appointment, not in the academy or the museum world or library world. And I think that there's one place where the two are in. There's an overlap. You can be an independent scholar, you know, junior, middle, or very senior, but oftentimes it's support to attend meetings and to get to meetings and to get to you know, committee meetings. So the burdens of travel are again one of those things that we've been trying to figure out a way of doing. We've spent in the past, especially I think the past 5 years, really quite a lot of SHOT money as well as NSF money that's been helpfully coordinated with the History of Science Society to try to bring as many people as possible and to facilitate travel. And I think that's going to become an acute problem in the next couple of years as university budgets and institutional budgets are stretched to their breaking point. So I don't see an easy answer to that, but that's been something much on our minds. This professionalization workshop that the ESIG folks are talking over, that's online. That's this format, basically a Zoom platform or one of the other software platforms and a chance to meet informally. So that's those are some of the things. SHOT members also, let me just say, as a graduate student, you get on the regular program as well. You're not relegated to the early career program. There's many graduate students and early career scholars, and even a few senior scholars that make the regular SHOT program. So it's pretty much across the board.
Thank you, Tom. Keith, at AAHM?
Yeah, so graduate students and recent postdocs and independent scholars fill a number of roles. I should say that one of the key concerns in this year with the loss of our in-person meeting in May is the importance, one of the drivers behind moving those panels online was the desire to make sure that young scholars in particular, people who are working on dissertations or people who have finished the PhD and really need and desire a kind of feedback from scholars in the field are given that opportunity. So a lot of the impetus behind moving those panels online in November, December, and January is to make sure that it's not a lost year of feedback particularly for junior scholars. But quite apart from that, we have things like, we have a student affairs committee, which has 2 graduate students on it that feed sort of insights and advice back to the leadership, the council. This year in particular, in arranging for the remote arrangements committee to plan next year's annual meeting, whatever that looks like, we have 4 graduate students involved in that, as well as a couple of junior scholars. The idea being that we really see this as an opportunity to not only to expand representation. We usually would not have junior scholars on our program committee, but it just struck us as absolutely important to have junior scholars, rising scholars, young scholars' perspective on how to engage around the history of medicine, the history of public health, and the issues that intersect so much with public conversation. We have some junior scholars, mostly assistant professors, on the prize committees, on the education and outreach committee, and as Tom just recently mentioned, also on the diversity and inclusion committee. There's an independent scholar on our council, which is the executive body that makes policies. So, and I should say also that the person who is chairing our remote arrangements committee to kind of imagine what 2021 should be is a non-university based historian of medicine who runs a state council for the humanities. So, in addition to that, we have archivists and the librarians, et cetera, of really a full diversity of kinds of people who are invested in the history of medicine and public health involved in different parts of our organization. I should say one other thing about junior scholars. When you have done these online activities like the Pandemics Conference, it is the graduate students and postdocs who are most active in social media and who therefore, more so than the older cohorts like myself, who are therefore able to kind of amplify and engage. And as I said earlier, the history of medicine is at a very specific kind of paradoxical moment where, on the one hand, professional opportunities have, for the moment, given the economic crisis, dwindled, and yet we are at a moment when the topic that we write about has never been more relevant, both within the academy and within a broader kind of public conversation. And so a good example is like when I worked with the AHA to gather the new writings of our members, many of those new writings were graduate students, and I discovered graduate student and postdoc work through this vehicle. And I've now assigned some of those in the course I'm teaching in the fall. So I like to think that if we're attentive to this moment and do a good job of curating this activity, that we can both individually advance the careers of our rising scholars, but also kind of collectively advance the field.
Thank you. We have a series of questions that seem to be clustering about inclusion and diversity as well as online connecting. So let me see if I can summarize some of them that Larry Kessler has been collecting and usefully summarizing. One is that the meetings were useful for making networks, making connections, meeting each other, for junior scholars in particular outside of the talks. So the question generally is, are there downsides to this kind of Zoom meeting and how can we address them? And we've been doing online networks since Skype was the only option. And we always got questions like, you're going to record this, aren't you? Or you're not going to record this, are you? So there's opportunities here, but there's also worries. And we're all trying to take advantage of the opportunities. But how are the societies thinking about addressing the downsides of this kind of remote connectivity? And then we'll move on to some questions about inclusion and diversity. Sorry, Tom, would you start? You already mentioned some of this in your earlier responses.
Yeah, so I'm writing about Arab Spring. And one of the pivotal figures there was this Egyptian man, Wael Ghonim, who became famous for this book, Revolution 2.0, which was purportedly, when he published it, how the people in the streets have more power than the people with the traditional levers of power. And he was involved with the street protests that knocked down Hosni Mubarak, and for a time, I think became he's a very brave man. Went to jail for 11 days, and his book is basically a kind of unabashed celebration of the power of social media to change the world. And he reflected on that and gave a TED talk a couple years later, and he said, "That's what I believed then. I was wrong." And I'm trying to think of a way that we can gain access to his insight. And he said he was wrong in a very specific way. He said social media, the way that it's constituted now, doesn't start a conversation. It doesn't build community. That was his main sort of diagnosis. It was great to get thousands, tens of thousands of people out into the streets, but it didn't build communities. And it struck me that that's what we need to do, is not mass mobilize around flashy memes and get people angry or upset or excited or enthused, but we need a new kind of social media that allows us to have not short conversations, but long conversations. So Wael Ghonim spent much of the subsequent years from Arab Spring trying to build social media that would be long form, that would build communities, that would have a kind of not contemplative, but an intentionality to them. And I don't know so much about them, but I'm thinking that that's an area where our social media, when we say Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or whatever, it's built for reasons that aren't ours. It's built for an advertising model, for fast, for flashy, for things that get the moment, sort of everybody gets excited about. But what we need is something really quite different. And if we had a social media form, and I'm not even thinking, imagine Twitter done differently, I'm just thinking of some different form that would allow participation, but a degree of intentionality, and that would build in conversation. Wow, what would that do for our ability to do networking? Because that's what networking is, right? You introduce yourself to somebody, and then you can have a conversation, and it doesn't have a single path. It has multiple different paths. Sometimes it's just, oh, let me give you my card, or it might be a medium length conversation, or it might be a substantive conversation, but it's a longer and intentional conversation. And our social media is not designed to do that. It's designed to do precisely the opposite. So I'm just thinking that over the next few years, we're going to be searching around for something different than what we have right now. And what that will be, it's really hard to tell. But people who've used social media to dramatic effect, I mean, Wael Gonim is internationally famous. You can look him up and he's like everywhere. And he's a brave person, but he's brave in two different ways. He's brave in a kind of physical sense, but he's brave also in an intellectual sense, thinking, well, I thought this during Arab Spring, I was wrong. Here's what we really need out of social media. So many of these conversations about inclusivity, about networking, about the character of our annual meetings, if we're going to be putting stuff online, the character of social media and what kinds of affordances it has, what it permits us to do, and what it makes really difficult to do, I think that's going to be a really pressing question for us to confront.
Keith, has there been discussion on this topic at AAHM?
Yeah, I think we're trying to, as most societies, figure this out. And I think the moment seems to require a kind of engagement with not just questions of race and, in our case, things like social inequality, but also health inequality as manifest in COVID-19. We are living in a time of extraordinary social unrest and a desire to kind of change the systemic kind of structures of society to be more just. And at the same time, we're isolated, right? We're sitting in rooms and told to socially distance in a way that safeguards ourselves and the public health. And it's not exactly clear how we marry these two and make them speak to one another. So one of the things that Tom just mentioned is the AHM is trying to figure out, and HSS and SHOT just sort of went down this road themselves, is there a better platform for engagement that allows, for instance, things like for an annual meeting or a virtual forum, breakout rooms that are thematic in nature, so that social networking of not the kind that happens in an annual meeting, but a new kind, maybe around very particular. So at an annual meeting, you might have a lunch unexpectedly with 3 other people. Are there ways in which you can guide that, make that possible, but maybe even make that happen around particular themes, like inequality, and like understanding the implications, the social implications of a pandemic, or making sure that vaccines, how vaccines relate to issues of equity in society. So I guess what I would say is we're figuring this out. We're trying to figure out what the limitations are of these new modes of engagement, but also realizing that we're laying the groundwork for whatever happens next when we move back. I guess the last thing I'll say is the last couple of meetings that we had at AHM, we had really vibrant lunch sessions around these questions of diversity, inclusion, professional development. So it's not that we weren't already doing that. What we want to make sure is that the isolation, the social isolation that we're all experiencing now doesn't squelch that, but in fact can be used to kind of catalyze it. And that's the kind of thing that our remote arrangements committee is thinking about. That's the kind of thing our council is thinking about. And that's certainly the kinds of thing that we're polling our members about, so that we design a meeting or maybe a series of meetings that kind of can make the best of this bad situation.
Thank you, Keith. Jan?
I don't have much to add to what Tom and Keith have said, because we're all trying to work this out at the moment. I know that our planning committee for the virtual forum has looked at the capabilities of online platforms for things other than formal sessions. For a number of years, for example, at the in-person meetings, we've had a mentorship event where graduate students and early career scholars have been invited to interact informally with more senior scholars and pick their brains about whatever it is, preparing a paper for publication or drawing up your vita in a way that makes you emerge at the top of the pile of job applicants or whatever. And we're trying to figure out a way. We will have something like that online at the beginning of October, and I'm not myself familiar with what it is in the platform that allows that sort of event to occur and exactly how it's going to occur. But we are trying to not replicate, but in some way substitute for the those kinds of informal, interactive occasions in an online form. And I mean, since you mentioned, Babak, downsides, I mean, we have to acknowledge that people don't always behave very well online, and so we have taken measures. We have a respectful behavior policy, which was drawn up initially for in-person meetings, but we've tried to figure out how it would apply to online meetings. And we have a social media policy as well, or a policy to deal with situations of online harassment. So we're trying to think about that as well, how to make sure that those kinds of interactions are productive and collegial, and they don't end up reproducing some of the worst features of social media that we're all familiar with.
Thank you, Jan. We've gotten a bunch of questions, I don't quite know how many, asking for specifics about potential directions, efforts, initiatives for inclusion and diversity. People have mentioned specifically issues of race, issues of gender and sexuality, issues of income and class, and also internationalization. So these are big questions, and I think, Keith, you mentioned that these issues in line with the social media and online activity. Can you give us some, I don't know, some directions that might be potential pursuits for the societies to increase diversity and inclusion among these various categories and identities? And it's a complicated question. I can't think of a concise way to put it, but maybe I'll stop there.
Right. So if I could break it down a little, I'll say a couple of things. First, a caveat. So the challenge of diversity and inclusion for a professional society is quite different than, let's say, as I was a chair of a history department or a vice dean in the School of Public and International Affairs. That is to say, we're not a hiring institution. So, the kinds of challenges that employers are sort of the sorts of things that employers need to attend to in diversifying the faculty, the staff, et cetera, don't fall as firmly within our society. So when we think about diversity and inclusion, we're thinking about maybe two kinds of things. Diversifying our membership and expanding and the topic range that is included in the conversation around the history of medicine or the history of public health. And then you might say kind of turning our members to the task of speaking more and engaging more with questions of inclusion and diversity, not only in the topic range of medicine and health and the biomedical sciences, but also more generally, because the medical issues are kind of adjacent to social and political questions, right? So in some ways, as a society, we're about promoting awareness and scholarship. And so what are we doing? Well, rather than kind of having a top-down approach, as in we ought to be doing this, one of the things that we've done is created we have a diversity and inclusion committee, but we've created a subcommittee of our council to write a mission for what a society like ours should be doing in a time like ours, where the questions of COVID-19 and the pandemic are surfacing, but also accentuating really profound questions about inequalities of health experience. So it's not, it's a tricky question, because one of the things that we have to do as a society is to understand what our limitations are. We can't change the way the academy works, but we can change the way historians of medicine and public health do their work, think about, and engage with these kinds of questions. So we have committees at work helping us to think through these kinds of questions. The other thing that we've done, and I think we've done a fairly good job with it over the last 5 years or so, is to make the society much more welcoming to these kinds of conversations, in our luncheon talks, in our panel discussions. But in some ways, we're just reflecting how the field has gone over the last 10 or 15 years or so. When I started, I work in race and health for my entire career. I started I think I finished my PhD in 1992, and I could count maybe on one hand the number of people who were working in this realm. And right now, it's quite extraordinary. So in some ways, our job is to curate and to disseminate and to encourage this kind of scholarship, because after all, we are primarily a scholarly society.
Thank you, Keith. Jan?
Yeah, well, I could add to that we have a committee on diversity and inclusion, but the initiative that I mentioned on the inclusive and transparent governance review is another attempt to address some of these questions. I think we have to start from a position of recognizing that we have a lot to do on this front, and I've been very struck and alarmed to hear anecdotal reports from individuals who attended some of our meetings in the past and found the atmosphere unwelcoming. That's something of great concern to me. I think going back a few years, we used to hear those sort of anecdotal reports, in many cases from women, and when we formulated our respectful behavior policy a few years ago, I think we were primarily thinking about gender issues. And about the ways in which, in some respects, to some degree, the atmosphere at our meetings might have been unwelcoming to women. I think we now have to think about that same issue in relation to other dimensions of diversity, in relation to racial diversity and internationalization and career diversity and so on. And as I say, I think we have quite a lot to do on that front, because we still are hearing anecdotally that people feel themselves unwelcome at some of our meetings. A couple of things I could just point to. I mean, the ISIS, the latest issue of ISIS, our flagship journal, some of you will have seen, there was a very substantial feature discussion about the issue of racial categorizations and collecting demographic data. This is something that institutions often feel they need to do to provide some benchmarks to measure their success in increasing racial diversity. But it is a problematic enterprise to ask people to identify themselves racially and to collect those statistics. And so we decided we wanted a an open scholarly discussion about the history of that sort of enterprise of collecting those kind of demographics. And that's what you'll see represented in that section of ISIS. And we're trying to build on that to figure out how to go forward in providing ourselves with some kind of data that would help us to measure further progress in that direction. But as I say, I think we have to start by recognizing how much needs to be done.
Thank you, Jan. Tom, how is SHOT addressing questions about diversity and inclusion?
I'll have to say I agree with what Jan said in one very specific way. Well, frankly, it's humbling. I mean, SHOT, since we were organized in the late 50s, we've always thought of ourselves as being a welcoming, collegial, friendly society, low barriers, everybody is welcome. And it was quite shocking, I will say, and hard to hear that some people had the same experience at a SHOT meeting of being unwelcome and to have an atmosphere be unwelcome. And so that should be like a flag that gets waved in front of all officers of all learned societies to try to figure out, well, what were we doing right, but what slipped through the cracks that didn't, that sent us down the wrong path. Here's one concrete example that surprised me. We were meeting, will be meeting in New Orleans. And when you look at the city and region of New Orleans, you can't help but think that there is an entire deeply structured racial dimension to almost everything that goes on. It's a racially segregated space, let's put it that way. It's economically segregated. There's many different dimensions. And somebody commented, so in our SHOT call for papers, which is a kind of programmatic statement, we invite papers for the meeting on all aspects of the history of technology, but we would we went social justice, we went structure, we went infrastructure, policies, on and on and on and on and on. But apparently we did not include one keyword, and it's like a Raymond Williams keyword. We didn't say race. And somebody pointed out, this was months and months later, they said, but you didn't say race. And it was just like one of those silly things that we apparently didn't have the right group of people around the table when that call for papers was issued and commented on and lovingly crafted, and we forgot the word race. And somebody said, well, I just look at calls for papers, and if it doesn't have that word in it, then I go elsewhere. And that's one of those places where, without intending it, we were blind. And so I think figuring out not only how to avoid the absence of keywords and the inclusion of the correct keywords, that changes, right? Everybody in my age at a certain time had to learn BIPOC, what was that? Black, Indigenous, persons of color. It's a useful term now. So there's other kinds of keywords that if we're trying to reach out and to be inclusive in racial dimensions and in gender identity questions and in perspectives, then there's a discussion that's going on almost in popular culture, and younger scholars are just attuned to that in a way that people of an older era or an older age find it really challenging. Other thing that I'm thinking about, we've been thinking about carefully about how to structure our international outreach. And there, I think we've hit on a kind of short, medium, and long term. So short term, we just have international scholars that come in, they're named, it's a 2-year, essentially a kind of, welcome. There's 6 or 8 each year. So that's a short term, it's kind of at a low level. And we've had a medium term. We've supported workshops and conferences around the world, co-funded, not support, but co-funded. And that's kind of with the idea that somebody does a conference, it takes them a year or 2 to plan, and then hopefully the conference itself gets SHOT branding. And then what we want is to have papers from that conference then be fed back to the annual meeting. And then the third, more longer term dimension of internationalization, I'm just thinking we could do the same thing with diversity and inclusion. We could have short, medium, and long term. That's where this is going. But in the long term is really looking at different research groups around the world, choosing, one or two or three countries at a time. Our finances are limited, and establishing a 3, 4, or 5-year period where we would set up a series of workshops with the same goal of increasing traffic between kind of the core SHOT community and people that are in Latin America or in Asia, in different places where we haven't been as active as we want to be. So it may be the case that we don't have to think of like one single thing, but thinking of just different layers, both short, medium, and long term. That might be a way of getting some purchase on this, and thinking that there are different ways of starting a process. We're really talking about starting a process of organizational cultural change. And first off, not going to happen overnight, not going to happen in 6 months, might happen in 6 years, right? Think of, women's issues. It took SHOT probably 10 years fully to respond appropriately and to make mainstream considerations of gender equality and putting gender, front and center on the intellectual and topical map. This is probably something similar, that it's going to take a sustained effort over way longer than 6 months. It's not a 3-year effort. It's probably something that we will be grappling with really, for the next, I don't want to say 10 years and then stop, but it's not going to be easy to change patterns of our own organizational culture that have crept in. We didn't intend to be racially exclusive, but by not including that word in the call for papers for New Orleans, we missed a major opportunity. That's a pity. We have to do better.
Thank you. We have another series of questions and a clump of questions that are focused about the jobs crisis, and everyone I think is using the words jobs crisis. And those seem to have 3 kinds of issues that people are mentioning. One is what to do about it. We are hearing about several places are canceling tenure jobs recently in the last few weeks. Is there an effort to promote tenure track positions or to increase tenure track positions? Does the lack of young scholars finding jobs, the difficulty of young scholars finding long-term jobs, threaten the mission of the societies in promoting scholarship, and how should we be responding to that? And insofar as long-term tenure track jobs are decreasing, are there possibilities, and can we think about promoting possibilities outside of academia for long-term employment of historians of science, technology, and medicine? Hard, good questions, but hard questions. Who would like to go first? Jan, I don't think you've gone first yet.
I'm not sure what I have to offer on this. I mean, I think we recognize the seriousness of the situation. I mean, there's never exactly been a time when the academic job market wasn't in crisis, but clearly we're in a very, very serious situation now where individuals who have jobs are losing them. And I mean, the society is, there's a limited amount that we can do, but we clearly need to think about this seriously, because you're right that in some respects this threatens our raison d'etre. I mean, one thing obviously is we need to diversify our own activities in a way which serves people in other kinds of career tracks, and to do our best to support scholarly activity in history of science, technology, and medicine conducted by people who don't have the privilege of a university position. I guess another thing that we can think about is the ways in which we are active in the public domain, promoting the importance of the scholarship in the history of science, technology, and medicine. As Keith has mentioned, I mean, it shouldn't really be necessary for us to make that case at the present time, but it is, and we do need to figure out ways to make that case more persuasively and effectively. I think we're largely dependent on our particular members for doing that. I mean, we have members who are active and clearly talented in a variety of public domains in different media. And we can encourage them and we can try to promote their efforts, but it's not clear exactly how learned societies can be involved in organizing those kind of activities. So I mean, there are other initiatives we could think about. We used to have an initiative, for example, that sent distinguished historians of science to university and college campuses to give a lecture to encourage people to think about creating positions in the history of science, technology, and medicine at those institutions. Maybe that's something that we need to revive. But our resources are inevitably limited. We're not, as Keith says, hiring institutions.
Has this been a conversation that shocked?
Yes, and I think it's a little, to me personally at least, it's a little frustrating because I can imagine some version of this conversation occurring 5, 10, 15, 25. I mean, it goes back. Like, how can we engage the public? How can we get the word out, et cetera? And I'd like to focus the question not outward so much, because I think there's some members in our communities, all of them, that are just geniuses at a kind of a flair for promotion. They should be our public faces. From a scholarly society, I think it raises a kind of fundamental question about what do we do for our members? And maybe in the past, we thought that just offering a journal and running an annual meeting was enough. That was like we were dangling something before a willing set of historians and others interested in our instance, interested in some aspect of technology and culture. And that was enough. But it raises a question, so what do we actually do and how can we do it better? So if it's the case that you want information, then the journal is fine. You don't need to change that much. If it's the case that you want to give papers or to hear papers at an annual meeting, then we don't need to change that too much if we're moving to a place where an in-person meeting is not the center of our activities. And I think the challenge in my mind is really a very specific one. What do we do to build a community when we are not meeting in person? So those questions about networking and interaction and being able to meet people, meet new friends or new acquaintances, people that you don't know, and how do we work on those sets of new activities? I don't have a good answer to that. People that are younger than me are very happy. I've noticed, with Zoom meetings, there's somewhere between 1/5 and 4/5 of the community is really having a conversation on chat. That's where the conversation is. And I didn't learn that skill. I'm sort of more center. So there's new skills, but I think there's new platforms. And for sure, I think that we need to be addressing the question, what do we as a scholarly society provide to our members with a special focus on younger members that don't have deep pockets necessarily at all? They don't have a university that can help them with travel. Maybe they don't have a university at all. And I think those are really challenging and really tough questions. So the broader questions about changing the academic structure, I think that's outside any particular society. The ACLS or a consortium of societies might be able to exert some influence, but I think that's beyond what an individual society can do. But an individual society does need to have a very focused answer, and an improving and pointed answer to the question: what do we provide? Why would somebody become a member and remain a member beyond just going to the annual meeting? What's the value that we provide as a community, that may be partly paper, partly in person, partly online? That's another challenge, I think, that takes some work.
Keith, can you tell us your thoughts or reflect the discussions at AAHM about the jobs crisis?
Yeah, I can't say much about a conversation at the AAHM, although what I do want to stress is we are in the midst of a jobs crisis, but we are not at all certain what the duration and the depth of this job crisis will be. We were in a job crisis in 2008, 2009. I remember the first semester I was in graduate school, the stock market tanked, and there was a concern about what implications this would have for the job market. That was in the late 1980s. So the real anxiety is how deep and extended will this particular crisis go? I should say something about the American Association for the History of Medicine relative to this question, because we're a professional association of historians, yes, but also physicians, nurses, archivists, curators, and librarians, and independent scholars. So if there's a job crisis in academia, it has a kind of a varied significance. We have physicians who are historians. My first job was in a department of social medicine in a medical school, right? And you know, I've straddled the history departments, but also public and international affairs. We have members who are in schools of public health. So one has to really ask the question, right? Is the jobs crisis uniform and uniformly devastating? Or is it something that is producing temporary or extended hiring limitations in certain areas, but not in others? And we're still not entirely clear. We know that this season is bad. The question is, will next season be as bad or worse? And how long will the recovery take? Now, given that, I mean, we're also in the AAHM in a very particular position, as I've emphasized a couple of times, which is the issues that are of the moment, understanding the dynamics of a pandemic, dealing with the distribution and the social and political issues surrounding a vaccine, debating masks. Our field, and I would argue the history of science and the history of technology, have never been more critically important to the public discussion around this. So I'm a kind of a cheerleader for our field. That is, and that's why I emphasize curating, and the fact is that our members have been out there writing about these issues. So it's actually made my job as the president easy in the sense that it is about curating, disseminating, and amplifying. The reason why I think this is important is I do have this maybe naive sense that when there is a rebound in the jobs, people will be interested in what the heck just happened. What's the legacy of crises of the kinds that we've just experienced? And I happen to think that it's the historians of technology, it's the historians of the biomedical sciences, those who can talk about the production and dissemination of vaccines, and the historians of public health and medicine who will be asked to play prominent roles in institutions of higher education or in other kinds of institutions. And certainly, you know, there's been an outpouring of writing. So I guess what I'm getting at is that our society has gone through multiple stages of developing in terms of diversifying its membership. It used to be that we were dominated by docs, physicians who took history as a kind of a side interest. We've become a professional society of historians with physicians and with nurse historians and with archivists and curators and librarians and independent scholars. And the question is, what kind of membership are we moving to next? So to me, it's a dynamic historical question. It's not a like, okay, our work is done, close up shop. It's how do we respond and build on, respond to the challenges and build on the opportunities of the moment. And, like I said, I tend to see as many opportunities as I see challenges without downplaying the significance of the jobs crisis, right? But there are going to be many other outlets for writing about and engaging with these kinds of issues. And as a society, we want to be supportive of people who are writing about, studying, researching, and interested in the history of medicine and allied fields. In fact, that's our mission, right? To promote and encourage research, study, education, and interest in the history of medicine and allied sciences.
Thank you. We are getting close to the end, and I just want, rather than me asking another question, if there's a few thoughts that you have to share with us in response to the conversations or otherwise.
So I had one quick, other comment about the kind of diversity, inclusion, racial justice, social justice question. And it's less about the history of medicine and the association and more about sort of my approach to this, which is that the pandemic has provoked us to emphasize people talk about structural racism, and it's the structural part that I think is perhaps most important to understand. Like, why are people in poverty who live in congested housing with multiple, family members in one dwelling more susceptible? How does housing, transportation, the nature of work, like in a meatpacking plant, make for disparities in the COVID-19 mortality? And then I keep going back to the sort of the vaccine. We've been debating masks as one preventive, but we're moving towards a very complicated story about how vaccines will be developed, social and public trust in vaccines, which has already been really devastated by the kind of vaccine denial, but is now going to be further complicated. I mean, I can't think of another topic that doesn't bring together kind of the social and political and economic history of science, technology, and medicine than what's going on with vaccines and what will be happening with vaccines in this pandemic over the next. So my feeling is our societies, our associations ought to be at marshaling the expertise that we have. And I've actually been pulled into many of the conversations with ISIS and to try to actually do that. And I guess my feeling is, without making us all pandemic experts, right, or late 20th century, historians, that we as a society need to be pushing into the foreground this kind of expertise. I think it will do our societies a great deal of good, and I think ultimately it'll help our junior members and postdocs and others to kind of say, this is the kind of work that my field represents. It's as it engages with issues of the moment.
Jan, did you want to?
No, I don't really have anything to add at this point. I think the questions took rather a form that we anticipated, and those are the things that are on all of our minds at the moment, unquestionably. Yeah.
Tom, any final thoughts?
I'll just take a kind of a counterpoint to Keith. I admire Keith's optimism and engagement. I think that's where we all need to be aiming at. Early in the racial reckoning this summer, I was on Twitter, and somebody said, if you're not an expert about race, keep your mouth shut, listen, and don't blurt out and assume that just because you have a PhD behind your name or any other degree behind your name, that you're an expert because you've read, whatever, 2 books or some larger or smaller number of books. So I think that there's a point, and I would just change the engagement just slightly and say we don't expect everybody in SHOT to be an expert on 20th century, or for that matter, 19th and 20th century biomedical technology. Far from it. Many of our members are uninterested and have no background, and in some ways should keep their mouth shut. Just saying it, so that the voices of experts that have solid knowledge are the ones that are heard, rather than somebody who happens to get the attention of a newspaper reporter. That said, it's abundantly clear that just, say looking at a 30-year period, topics in the history of technology that were not on many people's radar 30 years ago are front and center right now. So our special interest group with computers was very small. It was like 12 people. It wasn't 29, it was 12. And now it's the largest of our special interest groups. Why? Because there's a real interest, not only in terms of history, but in terms of people running museums and running archives. They need to know something about the history of computing as a field and the special knowledge that people that study computing has. And there's a kind of maybe a bit of intentionality that you could say, look, this is going to be a place where for the next 10 years, there are going to be people that need this knowledge, even if you didn't start out being somebody who's expert on public health and vaccines. That's a good thing to know about. It's a very good thing to know about. And it's a good thing for society to know about. But at some point in time, we have to be a bit humble and listen. And then at another point in time, we can say, now we're ready to say something in the public realm. Teaching is another mode, of course, where you can say things and say, I'm not a historian of public science or public health, but here's some things that I can tell you about this present moment from my background and whatever your expertise happens to be. So just a note of humility.
Always necessary.
Right.
Good. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I think these are big questions, and that maybe there's a role for conversations like this in the consortium. We're certainly getting pushed and pulled by the people who care about these questions of diversity and the jobs crisis and inclusion and ways of connecting with each other. So I think these will be conversations that will continue. And thank you very much for joining us today to share your thoughts and the perspectives of your societies. And thank you for the fellows for joining us, for your very good questions. I know I didn't phrase everything the way everyone wanted me to phrase it, but we'll continue. And thanks also to Larry Kessler and Matt Hofarth, who ran the show behind the scenes. For those of you who are fellows, please do join us Mondays beginning October 5th for the fellow seminar. And otherwise, please look at our working groups and join whatever interests you or start a new one. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Babak. Thank you.
This has been a podcast from the Consortium for the History of Science, Technology, and Medicine. You can find more resources for exploring this topic, other podcasts, video lectures, archival spotlights, as well as opportunities to connect with our community of scholars at chstm.org. This podcast is made possible with the generous support of the Pew Charitable Trusts, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the Rita Allen Foundation.